Hello, this is Ashutosh Varshney, and I'm here to discuss my latest print column um, published yesterday. And the topic is Mr. Modi, Prime Minister Modi's Ramnath Goenka Lecture, and in particular, his critique of Macaulay, Thomas Babbington Macaulay, who came to India to advise the Governor General in 1835, lived in India for 3.5 years, and fundamentally changed India's education policy. What did the Prime Minister say, and how do we judge it? Mr. Modi made two interconnected claims. First, with its glorification of Western heritage and denigration of India's civilization, Macaulay's education policy, it was called Education Minute. That was the technical term or the title of what he wrote and what went into British government's, not British government, East India Company's policy towards India. Macaulay's Education Minute fundamentally transformed India's education system. He argued it broke India's self-confidence. Atma Vishwas ko tod diya. Entrenched a deep inferiority complex, heen bhavna paida ki, and created an enduring colonial mentality, gulami ki mansikta paida hui. Second, these tendencies, he argued, were further deepened after independence. आज़ादी मिलने के बाद ये प्रवृत्तियां और भी पुख्ता हुई. India's economy, India's education, India's aspiration, he said, started relying even more on foreign countries and indigenous languages, indigenous culture. They were all consciously devalued. He would like, he added, this mentality, the Macaulay mentality, to end by 2035, 200 years after the adoption of Macaulay's education policy by the East India Company. So how should we assess Macaulay's role in India? To my mind, the issue is not whether Mr. Modi is right. Rather, the right question is to what extent he's right. Is he seeing a singular consequence where several consequences existed, some positive, some negative? Let us start with what the fundamental basis for a fundamental claim of Macaulay's education policy that was adopted officially was. He said that Britain, through East India Company, should create, and I quote, a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, opinions, morals, intellect, unquote. A class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, opinions, morals, and intellect. Mr. Modi's translation of these words is quite apt. Dikhne mein Bharatiya, man se Angrez. And for the Indian literature, Macaulay said, quote, I have no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic. These are the two languages, along with Persian, in which most of the literature of India at that time was available. But who could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India? Unquote. English thus became India's medium of instruction after 1835. And in elite schools created thereafter, for example, Labate near Calcutta, St. Xavier's Mumbai, Mayo, Ajmer, and in the less elitist government colleges in smaller towns with British principles, Indians began to learn Milton and Shakespeare. They ingested British and European history and made short shrift of the history and classical texts of India. But did these interventions create a widespread colonial mentality only. Gulami ki mansikta. There's no doubt that many in India fully met the description that Prime Minister Modi has used. Let me give just two examples, one Hindu and another Muslim. In 1868, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who later created the Aligarh Muslim University, or what became Aligarh Muslim University, took his son for admission to the University of Cambridge. And while living in London and England for about 6 months, this is what he wrote. It's nearly 6 months since I arrived in London. Although I do not absolve the English in India of discourtesy and of looking upon the natives of this country as animals beneath contempt, I am afraid I must confess that they are not far wrong in their opinion. Without flattering the English, I can truly say that the natives of India, high and low, merchants and petty shopkeepers, educated and illiterate, when contrasted with the English, are as like them as a dirty animal is to an able and handsome man. The English have reason for believing that we Indians are imbecile brutes. Imbecile brutes. All good things have been bestowed by the Almighty on Europe and especially on England. Unquote. In Bengal, the first province of India to get English education, some leading Hindu families in Calcutta were also thoroughly anglicized. Here is how the famous Aurobindo Ghosh, who later founded the Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry, was raised. Aurobindo, I quote from Ashish Nandi now, Aurobindo was the third son of his parents. The Ghoshes were urbane Brahmos from near Calcutta. Father, a doctor trained in England, forbade his children to learn or speak Bengali. Even at home, they had to converse in English. Their dress and food too were English. At 7 years of age, Aurobindo was taken to England along with two of his brothers, and the brothers were put under the tutelage of Reverend and Mrs. Dewitt, who were given strict instructions not to allow the children to make any acquaintance with any Indian or undergo any Indian influence. Aurobindo was exposed to the classical heritage of Europe, especially to Latin, Greek, and English, and he learned these further at Trinity College in Cambridge University, unquote. The question is, were these the only effects of Macaulay's intervention in India? Did the English language, in other words, and the instruction therein create only captive minds? And answer this question, and the two examples that I'll give should show that this was not the only effect of Macaulay's education policy and English emerging as the medium of instruction in India. The first example is Mahatma Gandhi's. He undoubtedly derived his commitment to ahimsa from the Advait tradition of Hinduism, which insisted that since all of us were children of God, no one should be killed. And for this, he didn't need English. Hindu texts in Gujarati, in particular, were sufficient. But his autobiography also makes it clear that three of the biggest influences on the idea of civil disobedience, which became the central feature of his politics and which led to three civil disobedience movements in India and which shook the British. The three biggest influences were Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, published in 1848, Ruskin's Unto His Last, published in 1860, and Tolstoy's The Kingdom of God is Within You, published in 1894. And he makes it very clear that these were the three biggest influences on his idea and doctrine of civil disobedience. Now, Gandhi also similarly broke up the ancient Indian tradition. He disowned that part which taught subjugation, picking that which taught love and compassion. This he this he did as what scholars call through critical traditionalism. He was not a simple traditionalist. His recovery of tradition was selective and critical. And on English and foreign influences, this is what Gandhi said. Quote, this is a very famous statement he made in 1920 or 21. I do not want my house to be walled in on all sides and my windows to be stuffed. I want the cultures of all the lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible, but I refuse to be blown off my feet by any, unquote. So, this idea of exposing oneself to ideas from wherever they can emerge, from India or from abroad, but remaining rooted, this idea is generally called, and I've called it in my writing, cosmopolitan rootedness. A bigger example, perhaps, is B.R. Ambedkar. For his PhD education, he went to Columbia, and of course, the education was in English language, Columbia University in New York, in the 19 teens. And he exposed himself to the writings of his mentor, John Dewey, a famous political philosopher of the time. And especially the idea that political democracy was certainly desirable, but a deeper democracy would have to be social, in that human beings should not only be equal in voting, but in social life too, the practice of equality should prevail. So for Dalits, it meant that having voting rights as well as electoral reservations was good, which Ambedkar was able to insert into the constitution. But a truer democracy would also give them social equality, for which he fervently advocated, including in the Constituent Assembly and in his politics. Even more significant, or equally significant, is Ambedkar's attitude towards ancient Indian traditions. He rejected Hinduism, and the only part of ancient India, that Indian tradition that he liked, was Buddhism, and he converted to Buddhism in the final year of his life. Ambedkar's rejection of Hinduism was not based on a blind imitation or internalization of Macaulay, or from a colonial mentality. It was based on a reasoned, internal, not Macaulay-inspired assessment of how shabbily the Dalits were treated by Hindu texts and Hindu practice. A third example takes us to Nehru, and also to the second point that Mr. Modi made. According to him, colonial mentality deepened after independence in production, in education, and in mass aspirations. And his reference here is to the system Mr. Nehru created. Nehru's production system was actually based on central planning and import substitution, which effectively meant self-reliance and a radical delinking from international trade and capital flows. If anything, this policy was deeply anti-colonial. It didn't deepen colonialism, it was exactly the opposite. When Manmohan Singh altered Nehruvian economic policy, in July of 1991, he famously argued in Parliament that it was time to move beyond what he called the East India Company syndrome, meaning that India should welcome foreign capital and India should connect with international trade. As for the education policy, one of the key Nehruvian initiatives was the creation of IITs. And IITs indeed depended on foreign collaboration. IIT Kanpur, the first one, for example, was created by MIT. But does Mr. Modi mean that IIT should not have been created? And did he mean that the aspirations of IIT graduates reflected a colonial mentality? As we know, many of IIT graduates migrated to the US, where they heavily pursued entrepreneurial ambitions and fortunes. They became some of the biggest entrepreneurs in America. Macaulay's children aspired to be officials and clerks, not entrepreneurs. That is a very different consequence of IIT, of the education policy. To conclude, then, it is beyond doubt that Macaulay's intervention led to a colonial mentality in several sections of India. But it is also equally true that, especially because of the English language, it also led to a lot of unintended consequences. Languages tend to be what scholars call multivalent, meaning human agency uses languages for all kinds of purposes, including emancipatory purposes, as it did in the case of Gandhi and Ambedkar. So English, in other words, was both a tool of colonial domination as well as one of the important tools for ending colonialism in India. Thank you, and I'll talk to you in a couple of weeks again.